Hey guys, since it's the Berkeley time, I will get started. So today's lecture is React 2. But before we start the actual lecture on React 2, I will for the next 10 minutes, I will briefly demo a front-end tool called Vivid, who is also the sponsor of our decal course. So let me quickly share my screen. Nydia, can you enable screen sharing?
Yes, 1 second.
Yeah, thank you.
It should be enabled.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you guys see the screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, great, thank you. So, so Vivid is the fastest way to build production-ready front ends. It will help you code faster and also visualize what you're building. So I'm not sure if the when the last lecture will come out. Didia, do you have any idea on that?
You mean last Wednesday's React lecture?
I think so.
The ed post for week 4 should have been updated with the link.
Yeah, gotcha.
So check that post.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I will just continue the demo for the time's sake. But yeah, you can check the ad post. So the Vivid is the fastest way to kind of like build your front end. And for the sake of demo, I will use Vivid directly on its landing page, which has Vivid already set up. But you can always add Vivid to your own app with a few simple steps. And this is a document on how to get started with Vivid. I will send you the link through the chat right now for any of you who are interested in it. So let's get started with the actual demo. I will just follow these instructions on the README. This is for Vivid demo. This is like a GitHub page for its landing page. And the setup for this demo is also pretty simple. So I encourage you to follow this demo while you're watching this lecture. So I already created an empty directory here called Vivid demo here. And I will just run these commands inside this directory. You can either use yarn or npm to get started, but npm works better on my computer, so I will use npm, but you can choose either of those. So I will first git clone this repository. And then cd into the Vivid demo folder that was created by cloning this repo. Then I will run npm install. Yeah, I think that worked successfully. And lastly, I will do npm run dev. I'll wait for a while. Yeah, I think it was set up successfully. So after you have run all these commands successfully, navigate to your localhost 3000. The link is here. It will appear on your terminal. So I will copy and paste it into my URL. And you can see this Vivid landing page. And just to make sure, if you click this bottom left icon, Vivid icon, you can see this like all your folders and directories on your computer. Make sure you choose the right directory that you're running this demo on. So for my computer, it's Vivid demo. So I will select this one and click edit files button, and it will work on this localhost 3000. So now we finished setting up the Vivid demo. So let's play around with this a little bit together, and I will run you through some of the basic functionalities of Vivid. So first, you can select any element by clicking that element while pressing Option button. And if you're using Windows, use Alternate key, Alt key. So while pressing the Option button, and you select that element, and then you can see its source code and a code pane where you can directly change the code of your original file. So here, for example, if I wanna, like, let's say I'm now clicking the Option button, and if I move around, I can see all those components on this landing page. Let's say I wanna select this visually text component. If I click that, yeah, you can see the code for this component in the original file. And so if I want to change this component, for example, let's say I want to make the left part of the text to a lighter pink. All I have to do is just change this code directly on this code panel that appears on your browser. So let's say I want to change it to 300. And now you see the pink here became lighter. Like originally it looked like this. Yeah. So it's really easy to change your code, and you can see that change immediately on the browser. And you can also move between the components using the arrow keys. So for example, let's say I'm moving around, I select one of the components, and if I click the upward arrow key, it will move you to the parent component. And if you click the downward arrow key, I'm doing it right now, it will move you to the child component. Yeah, and that's it for like selecting the element. And I will move on to the next part, which is like, so if you want to change the styling even faster, what you can use is a command palette. And the short key to open the command palette is Command K on Mac and Control key on Windows. So I will click Control K, and you can see this command palette appear on your browser. So once you open the command palette, it will show all the Tailwind classes on that selected element. So for this visually text component, there are these Tailwind classes that are available to apply to this component. And I will also explain what our Tailwind classes are in a second, but for now, you can think of it as a CSS class with a set of styles that are already predefined for you. And after you select one of these class and hit enter, that will add that current previewed class on the selected element. So for example, let's say I want to make this component background to black. Let's see if there's like, yeah. So, and the class for making the background color to black is called BG Black in Tailwind classes. If I select this and hit enter, wait, sorry, let me try again. Yeah, like if you select that element and open the command palette and click that Tailwind class, it will automatically apply that Tailwind class properties to the selected element. Yeah, so as you might have noticed, like all these changes through the Vivid only takes about 2 to 3 seconds, which means the front-end development with this Vivid tool is extremely easy and fast. And lastly, I will briefly go over what Tailwind classes are. What are all these classes that are shown on this command palette? And basically, this Tailwind CSS is a CSS framework, and it's different from all other CSS frameworks out there, like Bootstrap, materialize, etc., because it doesn't use high-level classes for components like alerts, navbars, cards, and all that stuff. Instead, what if you use Tailwind, you use like lower level utility classes, and you'll be given a specific classes like margin, spacing, colors, positions, and all that stuff. Now, because it doesn't have predefined button or alert classes, this will make you write a bit more code by yourself compared to all other CSS frameworks. But it's powerful in a sense that you can really customize your layout and you don't have to write much, if any, CSS code by yourself. And Tailwind, it's also pretty easy to get it set up. So here's the link to the Tailwind. Yeah, so that was the link to the website that will guide you through its installation. It's basically installing it, configuring your paths, and adding directives and stuff like that. Yeah, so that was a brief demo for Vivid today. We highly encourage you to use Vivid on the rest of the assignments and projects that are left in this decal course. Yeah, so now I will hand it over to Nitya to lead the lecture, to lead the React lecture.
Okay, I'm gonna get started with the rest of this React 2 lectures. I'm gonna first share my screen. Okay, can everyone see the slides? Is it visible? Just gonna assume that it is unless someone can't see it. Okay, so okay. So welcome to lecture 8, React 2. We're gonna be going over some more like React specific topics today in this lecture. So it's kind of a mix of a lot of things. So we're gonna go over the use effect hook, routing, styling, and then also like UI libraries. Okay. So I'm gonna first give like a quick recap of last lecture. Basically, React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. In last lecture, we went over a demo of tic-tac-toe, and in that demo, we learned some core concepts about React, specifically components, states, and props. And these are 3 very important things that you need to build like pretty much every single React app. So yeah, if you haven't seen this lecture already, I would recommend watching it or reading the lesson that corresponds to it, because it goes over some very fundamental React concepts. The other thing we briefly mentioned was Prettier and ESLint, and these are like basically code formatters / like packages that you can use to enforce some rules, and this just helps maintain code quality and make sure things look nice and also are clean. Yeah. So that's it for last lecture. Let's move on to this. Hold on. Okay, so I guess I'm gonna go over routing first. I wanted to do the use effect first. Okay, doesn't matter. I'm not sure what's happening with these slides. Okay, let's go over routing first. So as we went over in the HTML lectures, the way we route to different pages is with the A tag. And so you have like A, and href is the link that you want to navigate to, obviously. And if you wanted to like make it navigate to a new tab, it would be like target equals blank, something like that. But yeah, this is basically the syntax for it. And then inside the A tag is like the name of the link. And up until now, we've only done single page applications using React, but with HTML, we know how to do multi-page websites. So Tic-Tac-Toe obviously was only on one page. There wasn't any need for routing, but today we're going to go over routing because a lot of the websites that we see have multiple pages, and it's important that we know how to create multiple pages in a React app. So instead of the A tag, React routing uses conditional rendering. So basically what that means is that only the route associated with the component is rendered. So only one thing is rendered at a time with conditional rendering. And routing is a router is something that basically loads a specific URL path. So to put it in other words, essentially, each route in a web app is associated with a specific component, and only that component would be shown on a page. So unlike HTML, where the A tag directly links you to a different route, and that would be hosted on like a separate page, conditional rendering renders each component on one page without reloading. So instead of having a bunch of refreshes, like everything is loaded onto one page and then different components are placed on the page depending on which route that you chose for it. So overall, it's a better user experience and it's a lot faster than loading separate pages. So are there any questions on that? Conditional rendering, the difference between the A tag versus React routing? Okay, if there's no questions, I'm gonna move on. So obviously that's super cool. How do you load things onto one page? Like how does React do this instead of just opening new routes in a different page? And so to talk about this, I first need to introduce the difference between server-side rendering and client-side rendering. So let's start with server-side. Basically what server-side rendering, basically what it is you have a client, which is your website, and then you have a server, which hosts all the web pages. So with server-side rendering, the client is making a HTTP GET request to the server, and that is where your website is stored. And then the server will send back a new document. And on that document is like all the content of that page that you're routing to. And the page that you previously had is just completely thrown away. So the A tag that we use in HTML is an example of server-side routing. So to reiterate, we have two things going on. We have a client, which is our website, and we have a server. And then the user will click on a link on your website, and that will make a GET request, and the server will return a new website. Okay, so pretty straightforward. Client-side routing is a little bit different. Essentially, for client-side routing, what happens is the client will handle all the routing internally, and it will use the JavaScript to load the page, essentially. So that's why like websites that use React need JavaScript enabled, because in order to load the page, it needs JavaScript to run it. So that's just a fun fact. And another thing that's important to note is that the whole page won't refresh when using client-side routing, because everything is happening internally. There's no GET request to a server and no pages are being discarded. So the page itself won't refresh. Yeah, and so when there are websites with like many routes, like a lot of links happening, and you need like really complicated routing, it's better to use client-side routing because it's faster and you don't have to, the user won't have to like sit through a bunch of page refreshes every time they want to click on a link on their website. Yeah, so that's the benefit of using client-side routing instead of server-side. Okay. So how exactly do we implement React routing? So the way we do this is there's a package called React Router DOM, and we have to install that package into our React app in order to implement routing in our page. So I'm just going to walk through a quick example. So I'm going to show our Web at Berkeley website. So here it is, a whole bunch of things happening, but the main thing I want to focus on is this nav bar. So as you can see, the nav bar has like a whole bunch of links. So this is the home page, about us, the team page, everything really. And it even has some like drop-down menus with even more links. So there's a lot happening in terms of routing on this page. And as you can see, every time I click on a link, there's, oh, what did I do? This, sorry, decal will actually take you to a whole new page completely. But all the other ones, these are all like within the app itself. So you see the page is just not refreshing. Instead, the UI components on the page are changing, but the page itself, like you can see in the tab, it's not refreshing. So how exactly do we do this? And I'm just, instead of walking through a demo, I'm just going to show you this code example here. Just because in order to walk through an example, that would require us making a ton of pages, and that would take a very long time. So I'm just going to walk through this code, which we can find in lesson 9 if you want to follow along, or you can just watch the screen. So there are like 4 components essentially that we need in order to implement routing. So we're importing browser router, switch, route, and link. So basically, I'm going to start with browser router. So it's essentially the parent component to everything. So we have it wrapping pretty much all the routing that's going on. And one thing that's important to note with routing is that it has to happen at the root of your React project. So here it's happening in app, which is like pretty much the root of our React app. And you can't like implement routing in one of your other components like home or about. It has to be done in the root itself. And then moving on, we have a navbar, and this navbar contains a bunch of link components, and essentially these link components are like kind of providing a framework for the routes that we're going to use. So we have like a default /route and about, and then users. Okay, I see something in chat. Are there packages that auto route? Can you elaborate on that? I'm not quite sure what you mean by auto routing. That automatically do forward and backwards routing, like a pre-built component. You mean like that automatically reload the page, like do server-side rendering? Oh, well, if you wanted to do server-side rendering, you could always just use the A tag in your React app. There's no need to use a whole separate package. Yeah. But I can explain this a little bit later, but sometimes certain web applications, there's a need to mix server-side and client-side routing. So I'm sure that's like a very advanced topic. So I'm not really going to go too much into it. But yeah, if you want to do server-side rendering, just the best way to do it is just use the A tag. But otherwise, I think it's a good practice to use like the React router DOM package. Like it's the best way to implement routing in your React app. Okay. Moving on from that. Oh, so I was just explaining links. Yeah. So in this specific example, there's 3 different links that we're worried about. And then here is where we kind of get into the whole conditional rendering part of like our routing. So the switch is essentially what we're using to perform this conditional routing. So I could take out the switch and just have all these route components just like floating about, and it would work. Like there's nothing wrong with doing that. But the important thing to note about switch is that it'll only render one thing at a time. Whereas if I just had these routes floating without any switch wrapping it, then multiple things could be rendered at the same time as long as it matches the path. So for example, if I wanted to route to this like path with just like nothing past it, there would be 3 things that technically match: home, users, and about, and all 3 of them would render. So that's why if you want one page at a time, it's better to use switch so that only one thing is rendered at once. So switches, essentially they render routes exclusively. And then inside the switches, we have route components, and route components are basically the heart of routing as a whole. They're what map UI components to the URL path. So inside this route, I specify like which path I want the component to route to, and then within that, I place the component, like I call the component. So like here in this first example, route path equals about, I want at the path about, I want to route the about page, and it'll. And another thing that's important to note with this example is the order. So I want to basically, I put this route last because technically it's something that can be matched to everything. So it's better to put the more specific ones first so that these cases are caught before the home page. But I could also use exact path, and that would do the exact same thing. Yeah, it's basically like any other switch statement. If you've taken like 61A and know how switch statements work in Python, it's similar to that. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like a switch statement in Java. Like all languages kind of have their own version of this. So it'll only render one thing at a time, and whichever case gets matched first is the one that's going to get rendered. So that's why we're putting home page at the end. And then at the bottom, I'm defining all the components. Yeah. So are there any questions about this routing example that we just went through? Or routing in general? What does the about slash actually do? So I'm assuming you're talking about this line here. So in this line, we're actually calling the component itself. So basically without routing, you could just call all the components, right? Like in our app, you define 3 components and then you can call them like this. Remember we did that in tic-tac-toe. We had like square and then board and game, and then in board we call square, and then in game we call board, like that, and app calls game. So it's like that hierarchy. It's kind of the same thing happening here. We're just wrapping it in route components so that like this component about is matched to this URL path about. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Are there any other questions? Okay, I'm just gonna assume there are no other questions and go back to the slides. Okay, so that's it for routing. So I'm gonna move on to the use effect hook, which I actually kind of wanted to cover first, but that's fine. Okay, so use effect is another React hook that's really commonly used in web applications. And as a reminder, hooks are functions that let you hook into React state and lifecycle features. Specifically, React hooks are only used for function components, not class components. And I'm pretty sure the reading and the homework go over this, but there are differences in syntax between functional components and class components. And the standard right now is to use functional components, but I won't go too much into that. And so basically what the use effect hook does is it adds the ability to perform side effects from a functional component. And side effects are like fetching data, updating the DOM, and like setting timers, stuff like that. So this all seems a little bit abstract. So I'm gonna try and explain use effect a little bit through an example instead. So basically the syntax for use effect is it takes in two arguments. The first one is like a function, and the second is a list of dependencies. So use effect will call this function that you pass in when the dependencies change. So how do I explain here? So say we have an app that keeps track of like a score, and you want to update that score. So as you can see in this example, like the score is being updated using a state hook. Like the set score is obviously from a use state. But maybe you only want to change the score when the referee changes, for example. So that's where the dependencies come in, if that makes sense. So the function is not called unless the dependency that you pass in changes. Okay. It's kind of confusing. Are there any questions on that specific example that I just went over? Some questions. What is the type of the list of dependencies? It can be anything, to be honest. Integer. So the type itself of the second argument, it has to be an array, but inside the array, it can be anything at all. So like it can be a string or a number, Boolean, and anything. What's the dependency? What do you mean? Can you expand on that? I is referee in between square brackets. So that's just indicating that it's a list. That's what that syntax means. The second argument has to be of type list. Another thing that's important to note is the second argument is optional. Like it can be, you can just pass in the function itself and nothing else, and use effect still works. How does state management variables work? Can you create multiple instances of a variable? How does the variable get access throughout? Is it like a tree or something? Okay, so going back to last lecture, remember that we introduced the use state hook, and the use state hook basically manages the state of variables that we define in our components. So that's kind of how we manage the state of variables. You can use that function from use state to update the variables depending on like a button you click or some sort of functionality within that component. And then you can access that variable from the component itself. Yeah, does that make sense? Okay, is set_score an arbitrary function created somewhere else? Yes, I mean, in this example, yeah, like we kind of just like arbitrarily created a score and a set score. This is all a little arbitrary. Okay, this example is a little bit abstract. So are all variables accessed globally? So within the component, yes, like when you define, or it's within the scope of the function that you define the component, because remember, like components are functions, right? So use effect, you have to import into the components that you want to call it for. So you can access the variables for that component in your use effect hook. Okay, so essentially what I wanted everyone to get from this example is that use effect runs on render. So use effect, the function itself is triggered on render. So what exactly what exactly causes your page to render? That's when like your state variables are changed. So remember I mentioned last time that in tic-tac-toe, use state will essentially trigger a new render of your page when you update the state variable. And that's how we actually see variables change dynamically. So like in tic-tac-toe, we can't just like manually change variables because pages, like in React, the page is already loaded. So we have to use the use state hook, which will kind of re-render the page when your state variables change. And use effect is called on those renders. So that's kind of how those two variables are, those two React hooks tied together. Okay. So it's like top down and you have to pass it through, kind of. Yeah, essentially, yeah. Use effect is used in each component. Like, think of each component as its own ecosystem with its own variables and state. And so you would want to use, like, use state would have to be imported into every component that you use it. Same with use effect, if that makes sense. Okay. Are there any questions? Any more questions about what I just said? Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to summarize this. Use effect runs when the page renders, like I just mentioned. So there are essentially three cases there, and the three cases depend on like what you pass into the dependency argument. So if you pass in nothing, then the function will run on every new render. So like, for example, every time a state variable changes, your use effect hook will immediately trigger and run that function because you passed in nothing into the dependencies. If you pass in an empty array, then use effect will only run when the page first loads. And this is because you're essentially indicating that you don't want it to re-render every single time your state changes. So that's why you're putting nothing into the array, and ensuring that useEffect is only triggering when the page first loads. And finally, when you actually pass like variables in, then useEffect will be triggered when either of those variables change. So say you pass in like 3 different variables into your dependencies array. If at least one of them, if the state for at least one of them changes, then useEffect will be triggered. So essentially, you want to use useEffect when you want like a specific function to be called when your page, when you like your state changes. So the main use case for useEffect is fetching data from an API, for example. Like, say you have a whole bunch of like images stored on an API, and you want to immediately call that API and get those images loaded on your page. You would call useEffect so that every time your page first loads, it'll immediately trigger that function that calls your API. Or like you click a button and that will make a post request. That's another use case for useEffect. So I'm trying to give some more like real world examples of when we would actually use useEffect in our React app. Where would you pass in dependencies array? Okay, so going back to this, you call useEffect. The first argument is a function. As you can see in this example, it's an arrow function that calls set score. And then after that, you would immediately pass in the array. And then you could just use square brackets and like pass in variables directly. So like if we had 3, you could do like referee, maybe score. I don't know why you would do that. But like, yeah, you could just have like a comma separated list of dependencies within square brackets. That's how this is the syntax of useEffect. Okay, are there any questions about useEffect and like why it's used and the different use cases? That's a little bit abstract when you first get to it, but definitely very commonly used. So it's important that everyone understands useEffect. Okay, if there are no questions, I will be moving on. So the next half, basically the rest of this lecture will be going over some like styling. So the first thing we're going to talk about is CSS and JS. So what it's called is CSS modules. So in React, styling is global. So technically in our tic-tac-toe, you saw how for each component, I defined 3 separate style sheets for the 3 different components that we used. Even though I defined those style sheets, technically the styles themselves are global. So if I had class names that were the same amongst different components, but they had different styles. So for square, I had a container with one set of styles, and then for board, I had container with a different set of styles. Those 2 would collide, and then you'd get some very weird behavior. So the purpose of CSS modules is to make sure that your styles are not globally scoped, but instead component scoped. So what this essentially means is that instead of having all the CSS apply to every single component in the app, you want square to only apply to square, board to apply to board, and so on and so forth. So everything is component scoped instead. And the syntax for this is you import your CSS like as style. So instead of so normally you import like the file directly, right? So like if I define a CSS file like square.css, I would import the file directly. But here I'm importing the style as an object, and then the other thing I need to change is to add a dot module in between the file name and the .css. So, and then to call it, I would kind of index into my styles object in order to get the specific class name that I would want. So this is helpful if you're not very like creative and coming up with class names, but you still want like different styles for each of your components. This is how it's done. Are there any questions about CSS modules? What is container? So with in this example, you're just gonna have to imagine that the file styles.css contains a class called container with a bunch of class like attributes, like I don't know, like maybe it's a flex box with like a flex direction, something like that. That's what container is. It's just specific to the example. Are there any other questions? What's the difference between CSS modules and just having a bunch of CSS files? So I explained this a little bit earlier, but having a bunch of CSS files means that the scope is global, which means it applies. And what global scope means is that your styles for Square can technically apply to all your files, all your components that could be used that. So if you have class names that are the same in your different CSS files, then that could result in some like collisions, and that would lead to some really weird behavior, like weird look on your page. So CSS modules just ensure that your styles for one component only apply to that component, no other components. Yeah, so it can get tricky if you like are using a child in a parent component and importing two different CSS files, but maybe they have the same class names. So then the styles would be very weird. Does that make sense? It's just essentially ensuring that there's no collisions and that the CSS that you want for one component only applies to that. Okay. So the next thing I wanted to go over is styled components. So basically, styled components are when you write CSS in JavaScript along with HTML. So it's not the same as inline CSS. It's a little bit different, and I'll show you how with this example, with an example. But the first thing you need to note is that if you want to use style components, then you need to install the package to use it in your React app. But here is an example of like a style component. So as you can see, you have these two objects being defined, title and wrapper, and they each have their own like specific styles. So like, for example, title has like a font size of like 1.5 EM, text line center, color pale violet red. These are kind of weird styles. And you can see that like the syntax is basically an H1, but with unique styles. And it's the same. So like these are the H1 and the section are HTML elements that you are styling specifically. And then you can call those objects within your, like, when you actually render the component. So it's kind of like creating your own UI components from like HTML elements. Okay. Are there any questions about this syntax of styled component? Is this commonly used? Honestly, I've never used styled components. We just wanted to introduce it as another way to style your page, but I wouldn't say it's that common. Yeah. Okay. Couldn't you use classes instead? Yeah, you could, but if you want, like, if there's only like one or two things that you wanted to define, then like maybe it's useful. Like, say your page has a bunch of titles. I'm not sure why it would, but maybe you're like reusing this title a whole bunch of times. Maybe it's just faster to create a styled component like this instead of just like making an H1. Like maybe you don't want to like crowd your package with a bunch of like CSS when you could just do it within your component itself. That's like the use case for it. Yeah, but it's not really that common. Are there any other questions? Oh, also, the other thing to know is you can see these like backticks. That's just kind of denoting that this is in like a template string. All this CSS is within template strings. That's just how the syntax for styled components work. Okay. If there are no other questions, I will move on. Okay, so the important thing that I wanted to introduce is component libraries. So component libraries are basically ready-made UI components. So a whole bunch of like libraries, they'll have their own components like buttons, text boxes, text fields, sliders, accordions, like a whole bunch of like different UI components that go onto web pages, and each of them have their like styles. So fonts, colors, sizes, and so on and so forth. So instead of like defining these components yourself, you can just use predefined UI components from these libraries, and they kind of become like the building blocks for your components themselves. So there are a lot of component libraries that are very popular, like React Bootstrap, Theme UI, Chakra UI. Today, I'm going to talk about Chakra UI, which we commonly use in web dev at Berkeley. So yeah, it's a really nice UI framework. So I'm going to give a quick demo about Chakra UI. The other thing I wanted to briefly go over is why we use component libraries. The short answer is that it makes your life extremely easy when the style is just defined for you. I mean, you probably already know this from the homeworks that you've done throughout this course, but like CSS is very tedious. And it's a lot easier to just have the style for your website figured out. Like, and you can just use predefined components. The other thing is with these, if you use a component library, the design is very consistent in your web applications, like fonts, colors, sizes, shapes, like everything looks a lot cleaner because it's more consistent. So these are two reasons why we like using component libraries. They just make things a lot development a lot faster in general. But I guess a con of using component libraries is if you want to do a lot of customization, then it's a lot harder. The other thing that I didn't write here, but that is important to mention, is that component libraries make like figuring out the layout of your page easier. So especially when we get into like making your website mobile friendly, like component libraries make that logic a lot easier because they have their own grids and you can kind of adjust the style based on the size of your window, and they have the built-in functionality for that. So yeah, overall, it makes styling your page very easy. So are there any questions about component libraries before we get into the demo? Okay. All right, if there are no questions, I'm going to get moving to the demo. So the thing that we're going to build today is this card component. As you can see, it's very clean looking. Looks like a listing on like an Airbnb or like a website. Yeah, and we're gonna build this using Chakra UI. All right, I'm gonna close the slides for now. And then let's open a terminal and get started. So I have already created my React package, but to reiterate, you want to run npx create React app. I'm just going to call this lecture 8. I'm going to send this in chat. So navigate to the directory that you want this demo to be in, and then run the command that I just sent in chat, npx create -react -app, and then the name of your app. Okay, so that's going to take a couple minutes to install. So while while I wait for that, are there any questions about anything that I covered in this lecture so far? Not just about styling, user backdoor routing as well. Oh. Okay. For the sake of time, I'm just gonna move on if there are no other questions, but if it's still running, no worries. I'm just gonna get started with this. So obviously I have my React app open here. I'm in index.js right now, but here's our app.js, pretty standard. We went over this in last lecture. I'm just gonna go ahead and delete everything. And my page is blank. Yeah, and also make sure to run npm start in your, if you want to have your local host running, then make sure to have npm start running. So before we start, I'm just going to go through the Chakra UI website. I'm going to show you how I kind of navigate using component libraries. So first, we're going to get started with installation. So go to the chakra-ui.com, click Get Started. And then they have like installation instructions. So you can use npm or yarn. I used npm. Copy the command, and then in the outermost directory of your demo, so mine is called Chakra demo, I would run this command, npmi add chakra, to install Chakra into your package. And if I go into package.json, you can see that in my dependencies, this is where this component library is going, where Chakra is going. So I'll give everyone a minute to do that, and also to start a local host. And after you're done installing, you also want to make sure to follow these instructions. If you don't, import a Chakra provider and like wrap your app around it, then none of these components will show up on your page. So you need to make sure to set up the Chakra provider. So I'm going to do it in index.js. I'm just going to copy this line, actually. There's a question. How did I get the code again? So this is actually from scratch. I haven't done anything yet. Basically, I ran the command I just sent, npx create React app. And then obviously my app name to create a basic React app. And then now I'm just getting started with implementing Chakra into this. Yeah, so make sure to run this command. How do I install Chakra? So do you need any Chakra files or anything when using it? Yes. So basically, go to chakraui.com, the link on my web screen. Can everyone see it? If you can't see it, let me know. When you run npm start, you get an error. Make sure you're CD'd into the right directory. Like make sure you CD into lecture 8. Lecture-8. Yeah, click get started and then run either of these commands. I ran this npm command to install Chakra into my React app. Okay. Is everyone on the same page? So right now, all I've done is installed this. I have run this command to install Chakra into my app, and then I'm about to wrap my app around Chakra provider. Is everyone on the same page? Where in the project directory do you run? So you want to CD into like in the root. So in this case, it's called, the root is lecture-8. In the root, that's where you run that's where you run the npm command to install Chakra. Okay. Am I good to start? Has everyone installed it? And okay. I'm going to keep going then. So I've just imported Chakra provider. I'm just going to replace these React.strict modes with Chakra provider. Yeah, because all React.strict mode is doing is like enforcing some rules. So there's no need. I'll just delete it for now. Okay. And that shouldn't change anything on my app. As you can see, it's still blank. So let's kind of go through these docs a little bit. So the first place I want to go to is components. So my page is a little bit smaller. This is like iPad view, but you navigate to a page called components, and these are like, this basically provides documentation for all their built-in components. So they have like a whole bunch. And some of these may like look a little bit familiar to you, like the menu or like icons, images. Yeah, these are all just a bunch of like UI components that are used in a web page. So for example, if I wanted to, I don't know, input, like make a Chakra button, here's how I would do it. I would click on the button component to go to their docs about it, and then they give you instructions for using the button component, and a bunch of examples of how they're used. So I'm going to go to app and do all of this. The other thing that's important to note is if you want to just like play around with Chakra a little bit, you can kind of mess with, like, all these examples on their webpage are editable. So like I could change the color of this button to blue, and then the button just changes like that. So if you want to just mess around without actually changing your app or like worrying about like what you're doing, then I would just mess around with their editable examples. Yeah, it's just a cool thing to note. I'm just gonna make a simple one. So the first thing I want to do is just import it. So I'm gonna import button, and then within this div, I'm gonna delete this class name. There's no need for that. I'm going to create a button. Actually, I don't need button group. I'm not going to use that. And I'm going to call it, I'm just going to say the text of that button is click me. Let's see if it shows up. As you can see, yeah, here is the button on the page. It's just like kind of in the corner with like a gray color, but you can see that it's different from like an HTML button. Let me show you. Yeah, so these are both buttons, but they obviously look a lot different. But they both will have like the same functionality. Like if I hover over it, the cursor changes, and they both have like on-click functions. But yeah, the Chakra just gives you like basically an HTML button, but with like a lot of pretty styles. And I can like change the color of it. You can see the color scheme. Oh, I think it takes in a string. And so now my button is blue. And even like the text color changed too. So that's another thing that like Chakra has already kind of dealt with by themselves. So you don't even have to worry about like changing the text color so that like the text is readable. Like it already did that for you. Yeah. So this is kind of like a simple example. Do you just click and save and the rack site seems to update? Mine doesn't seem to update. Yes. So if you run npm start, it should just like auto compile your code, and then you'll be able to see your changes on save. Would implementing JavaScript with this be the same? Okay. Let me show you an example where they should have an example where buttons actually work. But yes, I'm pretty like, if you just define an on-click function and that had like, let's see if this works. Yeah, it still has the same properties of a button. So like you can still pass in an on-click function. Okay. And some of each UI library has its own like learning curve because they do things a little bit differently. So like Chakra is a lot different from like Bootstrap. And so they all have their own like specific ways of implementing things. I get a blank screen. Did you make sure to wrap your app in index.js with Chakra provider? That might be causing the issue. Or make sure it's also installed into your package. You can check that here in package.json. These should be installed. Yeah. Also, make sure you import the component, like import button. Oh, it's not on the JSON. Yeah, okay. So if you want it to be on the JSON, then run the npm command in the installation instructions. So you can find that on the Chakra UI docs. Okay. Okay, so now let's try like building out the card that we just saw with Chakra UI. So the first thing I'm going to do is let's go to, we could go back to components. Oh, actually, yeah, I'm just going to scroll through here. First thing I want to do is look through the image. Just because they give you a URL, I'm just going to use the URL of this dude because I don't want to find an image on Google. So I'm going to define a JSON object called property. And I'm just going to put the image URL here. This just is supposed to make the code cleaner, not 100% necessary. Some dude. I don't know who this dude is. Doesn't matter. And I'm just, so you can see on this component, there's a lot of like data on it. So like number of beds, number of baths, price, reviews, number of stars, stuff like that. So I'm just going to define all of this in this JSON object. So beds is 3. Oh my God, why did I do that? Baths is 2. Title, oh, I have to put a comma there. Title is Modern Home in City Center. Doesn't really matter. Oh, I see. I'm just gonna format this so it looks prettier in string format. So $1,900. And view count 34. And rating 4. Okay, that's pretty much all the data that we need for this object. Okay. Yeah, we're just going to use this image of this guy who is apparently on sale for $1,900. So. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is wrap everything in a box because you can see that this entire component is in like a square box. So I'm going to go to the box component, import box, and then I'm going to get rid of all of this. Okay. And as you can see, like with Chakra, there's a whole bunch of like inline styles that we can use to make our styles look nice. So yeah, I'm just gonna follow this. As you can see, it's our example right here. Oh, it gives you the URL. How nice. I'm just gonna copy that. Yeah, you can see this has the entire example. Why don't I just copy? So let's just go ahead and copy it because why not? It makes our things easier. And I will kind of walk through what we just did. So I'll walk through each of the properties a little bit. I think they explain it. The boxes are just kind of used to wrap your components. There's nothing too special about it. And you can like set a width for it. So here max W is like specifying like how wide you want this box to be, and Chakra has its own like, so SM corresponds to a specific width number in pixels. So you use their width as you can see, like if I hover over this, you can see like what exactly the box component takes in. So it has border width, border radius, and like border width can only be one of these values, like inherit, initial, medium, thick, like that, or like a pixel number. Yeah. What is app supposed to be? We're just kind of going through an example. No need to worry too much about like what app is. Right now, app is just kind of hosting this one card. Okay. So obviously this example uses a lot of components. So I'm just going to go ahead and import a bunch of them. Image, badge, box. Those might be the only ones. Logo is defined, but never used. Oh, star icon. I might have to import the star icon. Also, I don't know where I get that icon from. So I might just delete it for now. Oh, so, okay. So to get the icons, you can go here to icon button. Or they have a whole bunch of, they have a whole package of icons that you would have to import into your array. So like under the media and icon sections, you can see that you have to install it into your package because it's obviously, it's not here. So I'm just going to go ahead and install it. And now you can see the icons package is there. So they have a star icon. Here it is. So if I click on it, I think I just copied it. I don't know exactly what I just did, but let me just paste it. Okay. So I'd want to import star icon from here, like this. Import star icon from this package, Chakra UI icons. Let's see if that worked. So yeah, this obviously I'm wrapping this in curly braces because this package has a whole bunch of icons and I'm just like dereferencing them, if that makes sense. So see, now you can see, oh, why is it so zoomed in? I'm gonna do that help. Yeah, okay. Yeah, you can see this like kind of small card component. Yeah, so now my page is at 100%. You can see that the width isn't extending that far because I specified a max width for box. Image, it still has the property called source. It has an alternate also. So each of these components have like a bunch of like use cases. So basically the way to kind of get your way around like Chakra UI or any UI framework in general is to just look through the documentation and kind of like follow the examples as a guide. So this will give you like a clue about like what properties each UI framework supports. So like, and like how exactly you call these images, if that makes sense. Yeah, so this is how image works. Box has its own way of doing things. And sometimes, and once you get into like the form components, you'll see that they all have like specific ways of handling things. So like for example, with this component here, you can see that it's an input, and you can put a placeholder within it, and this is how it handles that. If that makes sense. Yeah, basically the way you use UI frameworks is just kind of following the examples that they give you and kind of learning as you go. Yeah. The other thing that I want to note is the style. Obviously, it makes the styling very easy for your React app, as you can see. Like, this looks super clean, and I did it all with their own components. I didn't have to define any CSS of my own. But like, it's very limited. Like, for example, these are the only ways you can do inputs. Like, this is the only way Chakra supports input boxes. Like, you can have the outline, you can have it filled. So it's not very customizable. Like, everything will have a specific Chakra look. If that makes sense. Are there any questions on Chakra UI? Like, any questions you have about how I specifically would use it? Do companies use raw CSS or CSS frameworks? To be honest, I haven't. It really, I guess it depends on the company. I've worked for companies that use CSS frameworks. Like, I worked for one that used Material UI. So part of me working for them was just learning how to use Material UI. But yeah, some use Tailwind, some use Chakra, and some define their own CSS, but I honestly, some also like define their own libraries. Yeah, I think it varies a lot based on the company. Do I recommend Chakra over other options? Chakra is definitely a very good UI framework. Like, it has a lot of support built in, and obviously it looks very clean. It's the one that WebDev uses the most. So I would definitely recommend using it. The reason we're introducing component libraries is to give you an idea of how you may want to like style your web applications when it comes to the final project. So keep Chakra in the back of your mind. Are you allowed to use many frameworks at a time, or is it bad practice or something? Honestly, I don't think you can use a bunch of frameworks at once, especially since they call their components the same thing. So like, Box and like Bootstrap would be the same. I don't know if Bootstrap has Box, but yeah, like even like Material UI, for example, it uses Box. So I don't know. I think that's bad practice. I'm not sure if technically you're like React will prevent you from using multiple UI frameworks at once, but it's definitely a bad practice. I would not do that. Yeah, you can do like import a box as like as B or something like that, and then call it a B, and that would be fine. But I'm not exactly sure why anyone would use two different UI frameworks at once. But yeah, so I would not recommend. Also, it is 8:03, so if you want to head out, we're past lecture time, go feel free. But if I can stay on for a few more minutes to answer any questions about component libraries. So yeah, that's the end of the lecture. It's just going to be a Q&A for the rest of it.
Hi, may I ask a question about the homework?
Yeah, of course. I'm going to stop sharing then.